Last week we explored the first foundation of mindfulness, which is mindfulness of the body. And when we begin practicing mindfulness of the body, we start noticing this world of sensations and information that our bodies are always communicating, but that we often ignore and exclude from our present moment experience. And this can keep us cut off from reality, unable to recognize the truth of things as they are. And instead, we stay stuck in the story we are telling ourselves about this moment. Or we are off in the past or the future, completely cut off from the present moment. And so as we pay more attention to what is going on in our bodies, beginning to acknowledge this world of sensation more and more, we see how often these sensations are driving how we feel, how we are experiencing this moment, and even how we are treating ourselves and others. And this brings us to our topic for today, which is mindfulness of feeling tones and emotions. I'm kind of bracketing emotions. The primary thing I want to focus on is feeling tones, and I'll elaborate on what that is. And emotions will kind of be a part of this week's talk and next week's talk a little bit. So mindfulness of feeling tones, and this is the second foundation of mindfulness. I want to use a traditional illustration to help us understand what's happening at a conceptual level. And in the traditional lineage, they talk about it as our mind like a fist, like a closed fist. And we're really practicing to allow our mind to come back to a natural open position. This mind like a fist functions to grab on and to cling to and grasp at things that we find to be pleasant, the things that we desire. Oftentimes they're things that are not here, and so we're grasping for what is not here, or we're trying to push away what is here, and we resist the things that we don't like. So the fist functions to hold on to, try to hold on to what we like, or push away what we don't like. And so the practice is really one of opening the hand of our mind, coming back to the natural position. And so this will play out throughout the course of the talk. When we learn to practice the first foundation, mindfulness of the body, we practice being mindful of this first layer of our experience, which are these various clouds of sensation that are in constant states of change. We have seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and bodily sensation or touch. And so this is the first layer of how we experience anything. It's coming through these five senses. And then in this second layer of our experience, the second foundation of mindfulness, we have an immediate reaction to any given sensation. And it's often unconscious, just meaning that we are not aware of this taking place. And this reaction is one of three potential feeling tones. And they are pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And so we can be mindful of these feeling tones at every level of experience. We'll primarily be focusing on the body, but we can notice these feeling tones at the level of our body, our emotions, our thoughts, our relationships, our inner and outer world, or just the whole of our experience in any given moment. each of these comes with a feeling tone of either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And we'll be building on the first foundation, mindfulness of the body. So that's the main focus for today in relation to the feeling tones. And as I said, for much of our life, these immediate reactions are taking place and we are not aware of them. We have these sensations from the first layer of our experience, our body, and these generate this second layer of experience, which are these feeling tones. And for most of our life, we are not consciously acknowledging this. And it ends up driving and conditioning the way that we think, feel, and act, affecting the way that we interact with ourselves, other people, and the world. And there's a story I want to read from this book that one of my teachers, Tara Brach, wrote. It's called Radical Acceptance. And I just picked this story out because I thought it was helpful to illustrate the point here. And it's a story about a white tiger at the DC Zoo. Her name was Mohini, and she says this. She says, Mohini was a regal white tiger who lived for many years at the Washington, D.C. National Zoo. For most of those years, her home was in the Old Lion House, a typical 12 by 12 foot cage with iron bars and a cement floor. Mohini spent her days pacing restlessly back and forth in her cramped quarters. Eventually, biologists and staff worked together to create a natural habitat for her. Covering several acres, it had hills, trees, a pond, and a variety of vegetation. With excitement and anticipation, they released Mohini into her new and expansive environment, but it was too late. The tiger immediately sought refuge in a corner of the compound, where she lived for the remainder of her life. Mohini paced and paced in that corner until an area 12 by 12 feet was worn bare of grass. Perhaps the biggest tragedy in our lives is that freedom is possible, yet we can pass our years trapped in the same old patterns. She says, unlike Mohini, however, we can learn to recognize when we are keeping ourselves trapped by our beliefs and fears. We can see how we are wasting our precious lives. So we have these three potential responses to every sensation we experience: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And each of these drives our inner world of thoughts and emotions. In the traditional lineage, some talk about feeling tones as our primary feelings, and emotions as our secondary ones that flow from the primary ones, just like primary colors have all these other colors that come from blending the primary ones. So if a sensation is pleasant, we want more of it. And this leads to desire in its many forms, like grasping, wanting, greed, exploitation, and power. One of my teachers, his name's Jack Cornfield with a K. He said, when we look at the wanting mind, we experience the part of ourselves that is never content, that always says, if only I had something more, that would make me happy. Some other relationship, some other job, some more comfortable cushion, less noise, too quiet, cooler temperature, warmer temperature, more money, a little more sleep last night, then I would be fulfilled. For the voice of wanting, what is here now is never enough. And if a sensation is unpleasant, we want less of it. This leads to resistance, anger, hatred, stress, anxiety, and depression, and ultimately fear at the root. There's another teacher, her name is Pema Chodron. She wrote a book that I like called The Places That Scare You. And she speaks of mindfulness meditation practice as the practice of a warrior. And she says that the central question of a warrior's training is not how we avoid uncertainty and fear, but how we relate to discomfort. How do we practice with difficulty, with our emotions, with the unpredictable encounters of an ordinary day? And if a sensation is neutral, we ignore it. This leads to ignorance, delusion, confusion, and complacency. So in Mindfulness of Feeling Tones, we're beginning to notice the powerful tendencies of like and dislike, and also ignorance and exclusion. One teacher, Joseph Goldstein, says mindfulness of feeling is one of the master keys that both reveals and unlocks the deepest patterns of our conditioning. So just like with sensations, these feeling tones of experience can change. We get a sensation, some craving for something sweet, and this is pleasant, so we desire to have some Oreos or ice cream. And we eat it long enough that we get a brain freeze or a stomach ache, and the sensations are no longer pleasant, so we don't want any more cookies or ice cream. So again, we can see the constant change and impermanence at play in our experience. That ultimately sensations are constantly changing. And so too, the feeling tones are constantly changing. And so they will never ultimately satisfy. Peace comes not from fulfilling our wants, but from the moment that dissatisfaction ends. Peace comes not from fulfilling our wants, but from the moment that dissatisfaction ends. So we begin learning not to place our contentment and our peace and joy in these feelings, because we see that the satisfaction will never last. This is not to say that we shouldn't enjoy life at all, or that there aren't healthy desires to have, or things that are right to stand in opposition to. But when we don't recognize that we're caught up in it, it can leave us stuck in a trance of dissatisfaction and joylessness. One quote I like a lot, it comes from a larger quote. I'm just going to share a fraction of it from a teacher I like. His name's Adyashanti. He says, "We think we resist it because it's there, but actually it's there because we resist it." So when we practice being mindful of the feeling tones of our experience, It can help us recognize the cycle of dissatisfaction and begin to unhook from what has us caught. In this little book here that I would recommend honestly to anybody, you probably can't see it, it's called How to Fight. And it's by a teacher that I've mentioned in the last couple of classes a couple times. His name's Thich Nhat Hanh. And he says, when someone says something unkind to you or something you disagree with, you may want to retaliate right away. That is where the fight begins. This habitual way of reacting creates a well-worn pathway in your brain. When you travel a neural pathway over and over again, it becomes a habit. Very often that pathway leads to anger, fear, or craving. 1 millisecond is enough for you to arrive at the same destination: anger and a desire to punish the person who has dared to make you suffer. The mind and the brain are plastic in nature. This just means that it can change. And with practice, you can create neural pathways that lead to understanding, compassion, love, and forgiveness. Mindfulness and insight can intervene, redirecting you down a new neural pathway. So when we've not learned to talk about our feelings or even to be aware of them, our life remains entangled. When pleasant feelings arise and we automatically grasp them, or when unpleasant feelings arise and we try to avoid them, we set up a chain reaction of entanglement and suffering. And as we practice being mindful of the body and mindful of feeling tones, we begin to notice this imperfect nature and impermanent nature of sensations and feelings. When we begin to recognize that there are these other factors at play that are really driving our thoughts and emotions and our actions. So we deepen our understanding of the impersonal nature of our experience as well. Is it Mohini the tiger? Is it her fault that she walks in a 12 by 12 foot square instead of recognizing the freedom freely available to her? Or did she just become conditioned to a particular set of patterns and pathways? As we practice, we begin to see that it is really a deep misunderstanding and a misapprehension to claim ownership over these forces at play within us that we are often unaware of that are driving our behavior. A scholar and a teacher named Walpola Rahula, sorry if I'm butchering that name. His name's Walpola Rahula, and he says, try to examine how it arises, its cause, how it disappears, and its ceasing. Try to examine it as if you are observing it from the outside, without any subjective reaction. As a scientist observes some object, you should not look at it as my feeling or my sensation subjectively, but only look at it as a feeling or a sensation objectively. So the practice is not one of criticizing and condemning and critiquing, judging and discriminating against ourselves, but simply observing, watching, and examining. You are not a judge, but a scientist. When we notice that everything is always changing, and that it doesn't supply us with lasting satisfaction, we begin to take the waves of experience much less personally. There's a story I really like about a monk and their student walking along this path through the woods, and they come upon this huge boulder. And the teacher says to the student, "Do you think that giant rock is heavy?" And the student says, "Oh yes, I imagine it's very heavy." And the teacher says, "Not if you don't pick it up." So in practicing mindfulness of the body and mindfulness of feeling tone, we become aware of these forces driving our emotions, thoughts, and actions, and we begin to unhook ourselves from them. There's a metaphor for unpleasant experiences being like a big tablespoon of salt in a small glass of water. If you've ever had to gargle some salt water when you had a sore throat, you probably know that it's pretty salty and not so pleasant, right? But now imagine the clearest bright blue water that you've ever seen, either in pictures or in person. Imagine this as a fresh water. Imagine this as a fresh body of water, like a freshwater lake. And what happens when you put this same spoon of salt in this crystal clear lake? The salt wouldn't be so bothersome, would it? This is how the practice of mindfulness can be for us in our life. Our awareness is like this giant lake, unaffected by the saltiness of life. And living from this perspective more and more in the midst of our life makes the moments that are normally like drinking a glass full of salt water a bit more like tossing a spoon of salt in a large body of fresh water. So when we practice mindfulness, we start to recognize this foundational aspect of our humanity, which is just being. And we cease to be so caught up in the doing mode of our existence because we see the ultimate dissatisfaction that it provides or doesn't provide. Whatever is aware of an object is not itself that object. And maybe that sounds a little confusing, but all I mean by that is, like, obviously this is a glass of water and I can be aware of the fact that I am not this glass of water. And the same thing is true in our mindfulness practice. When we become aware of sensations in our body, the feeling tones, the thoughts and the emotions, we begin to take them as an object of our meditation. And so you have the object and the awareness of the object. And all we're doing in this practice is becoming more and more aware of the awareness that's aware of the object, and ceasing to be fixated and caught up in the object itself, like the thought or the emotion or feeling or sensation. So as we become more mindfully aware of sensations, primary feelings, thoughts and emotions, we become less governed by them. We're really learning to shift our attention from the content of experience to the context. Just like when we think that we've lost our keys and remember that we had them the whole time in our hand or in our pocket, we cease searching for the key to our joy and our satisfaction elsewhere. And we remember that the key to our peace and our contentment is always with us. So we're learning to include more of what's here that we often leave out of our experience. when we include what we normally leave out as though it doesn't belong here, it has less power over how we think and act and feel. And we begin to move in a wise relationship with the sensations, the feeling tones, and ultimately our thoughts and our relationship to the world, both inside and out. And this process involves investigation, curiosity, acceptance and allowing, understanding and forgiveness. And there's a phrase that says the map is not the territory. And all this means is that a map is just a representation of the territory, but we still have to traverse the territory in order to understand it fully. The map won't fully depict the reality of the territory. So remember what I said, that the real teacher here is in your application of the practice in your own life. Zen Master Suzuki Roshi says, "The purpose of my talking is to give you some idea of the way, but actually it is not something to talk about, but something to practice." So it is not in what I say that you will find liberation, but in your own application of this practice. Thank you for your attention and your presence.